Thank you very much. I'll just start sharing my screen. Good morning. All right, so I hope my screen is up. So my presentation is going to take a slightly different turn to the two previous presenters. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the research that we do here in WA with emergency services volunteers. We have been doing this project for over 3 years now, and we've found out a number of things that we hope can help organizations and units and brigades to really better retain volunteers that they already have, but also attract more volunteers. As we have heard from the previous presenters, there's definitely always a need for that, particularly given the new challenges of longer fire seasons and other natural disasters that we all have to be experiencing more and more so. So what I want to start with is to highlight that last week, Australian Bureau of Statistics released the new report on the General Social Survey, which is a representative survey of Australian households. And they do have questions on volunteering as part of that survey. And unfortunately, it confirms the trends that we have already been aware. And the trends are as follows. In 10 years, we have lost about 10% of our volunteers overall. So 10% reduction in volunteering rates. And what's worse and what's more troubling, in 5 years, we have lost about 20% of volunteering hours. So we're not only losing people, we also are seeing the trend where the existing volunteers are contributing less and less time to the different causes that they are supporting. Now, these are statistics for overall volunteers in Australia, formal volunteering. And unfortunately, we know that this is representative of the emergency services as well. For example, here in WA, State Emergency Service faces about 20% turnover every year. So every year, they have to replace 20% of their volunteers, and this is typical of other emergency services as well. But these are numbers. We know them. It's easy to dismiss numbers. They don't have personality. They don't have personal appeal. Here's my personal appeal story. Now, this photo has been taken of a particular SES unit in WA. It has been taken in the first year when I started to work on this project, which is about 3 years ago now. I went to present some of the findings from our project about a year later, and someone approached me after my presentation and said, you know what, I know these people at this photo, and what you said about turnover, this is true. Majority or third of the people on this photo are no longer with that unit. And that really drove the point for them, but it also did so for me. This is when I realized how important this work is and how important it is to think about how can we help volunteers and units to stay and to remain and to continue to provide this crucial community service. So what I want to focus on today is to talking about a couple of crucial steps in this process that we call a volunteering journey. And what this means is that we need to understand volunteering as a process that unfolds over time, rather than focusing on sort of particular steps, such as, you know, how do we recruit or how do we make sure that someone stays. How we recruit is going to impact on all the stages through the volunteering journey. And another key aspect here is leadership. As Craig suggested in his introduction, I am a leadership researcher, and I'm really interested in how leadership shapes outcomes in both traditional workplaces, but particularly also volunteering contexts. So I want to talk to you about several findings that we have in those two key areas. So first off, the importance of expectations. When people join your organization or your unit, they come in with a particular set of expectations of what that volunteering experience is going to look like. So early on in our research project, we conducted a survey with over 500 volunteers with Department of Fire and Emergency Services here to understand what are the expectations that people have when they join whatever emergency service it is, whether it will be firefighting or SES or something else. And so what we found as part of that survey is that typically there are three sort of key profiles of these new volunteers. The first one are the ones that have kind of the right amount of expectations. They know what emergency services are about and they know what they're going to be doing there. The second one are the ones who join with too many expectations. They expect that this emergency service is going to offer them everything and they will satisfy all of their different needs. And then the third groups are the ones who don't have a clear idea or clear expectation about what emergency service is about and what are they going to be doing. And it turns out, as you would expect, is that having those realistic expectations or just the right amount of expectations is something that is really important to volunteer retention. Unfortunately, people who have either too much or too little are going to actually leave sooner and withdraw from the service. What this means in terms of practice is that you need to be thinking of how to set those right expectations early on. And often it is really simple. We tell our unit leaders and unit members here is that all you have to do is sit down with this prospective volunteer and have a chat to them about what is going to happen, what can they expect, how long the training is going to take, how long is it going to be before they can actually attend an incident or participate in actual volunteering. Because often people don't understand, and I think Karina mentioned this in her presentation as well, is that they can't jump right in and start fighting fires. They need training, they need to be safe. And aligning that expectation, you think it's obvious, they might not. So aligning that expectation is really, really important. So from there, what we decided to do is to look closer at the recruitment messages. So what are some of the materials? And this can be a brochure or a leaflet or a Facebook post or anything that you use as tools for recruitment. So broadly speaking, recruitment messages is anything in sort of in the space, how you're trying to attract new volunteers. And we decided to look at them because these tools are the ones that set these really early expectations, right? So by looking at these material, you as a prospective volunteer will start thinking, aha, this is what this volunteering experience is going to look like. So these messages need to have three things to communicate effectively. They have to be attractive and appealing. Of course, they have to accurately represent what that volunteering experience looks like, and they need to promote the diversity of roles that are available. So often people will have a stereotypical idea about, say, that firefighting volunteer service is only involved in firefighting as such. But often your units need other people as well, such as, administration people, people who can support the firefighting volunteers in any capacity, communications units and stuff like that. So really need to promote that diversity of roles. And so when I talked about accurate representation, this is, for example, a picture from a SES unit in WA. There's nothing wrong with this picture. This an actual member doing an actual, volunteering role with that unit. However, this has been communicated certainly centrally across our entire state. Now, out of the 65 units that we have here with SES, how many are actually training and doing vertical rescue? Not all. And so we have actually met volunteers who were disappointed, particularly the young people who actually joined their SES units because they saw this picture and they wanted to do that, but their unit that they joined didn't actually do it. So having this picture on the first page of that recruitment material sends the wrong expectation unless this is something that you actually do in your unit. So from that, we decided to see what how can we create the materials that are going to help the units to recruit volunteers and send these right messages and set the right expectations. So we conducted so far 2 studies. This is ongoing work. And we collected a bunch of material, for example, quotes, direct quotes from the interviews. We conducted over 70 interviews with existing acting SES volunteers at different roles. And we transcribed those interviews and we extracted the verbatim quotes as representations of volunteer experience. And we also collected lots of pictures. I personally sat through Facebook and went on every single unit's webpage to search for pictures that we could use for these purposes. So we have a database of both text and pictures that we can use. And we then went on and tested all of that material for those key criteria, which is the realism. Is this a realistic message about what happens when you're an SES volunteer? And we tested them for appeal and what expectations they set. And we did this with a community sample, which means these are the people who are not currently volunteering and are little familiar with the service, which are the perfect candidates for prospective volunteers. So out of all of this, conducting these several studies with large samples, we now have recruitment messages that are better in terms of attractiveness, in terms of accuracy, in terms of promotion of diversity, and also setting these right expectations. So here on this slide, you can see a mock-up poster that we have come up with that combines messages, the text and the pictures that we found is promoting a particular expectation. And you can guess it, in this case, it's teamwork. And teamwork, of course, is crucial to successful work in emergency services, again, as alluded by the previous presenters. We have several of these. This is just an example. And what we have also done, we have collected all of this information into a Excel spreadsheet that we've called a recruitment messages toolkit. And it's available to absolutely anyone to be used for either directly to put on posters or brochures or Facebook posts, or to just for inspiration. Obviously, some of these quotes will be very specific to SES, but majority of them are actually generic enough and can be used for a variety of different services. But at the very least, this can inspire you to come up with your own materials that are better targeted at what you're trying to achieve with your recruitment. The link to this resource will be shared in the My Session notes. So you can go on and anyone, it's free, it's available, have a look at it, and we hope that you can use it for addressing your own needs. The second thing that I wanted to touch upon is, of course, volunteer leadership. And when we think about volunteer leadership, particularly comparing volunteer leadership to, traditional workplace paid employment type of leadership, we can see that volunteer leadership is associated with a number of challenges. And these challenges are absence of financial rewards, which is the largest trigger for, traditional workplace management. Low position of power, which means that volunteer leaders or managers don't have as much power over, other volunteers. They can't tell them what to do, because then, those people can just turn around and say, okay, well, I'm going to go and volunteer somewhere else, or I'm going to do something else with my limited time. And we also realized that volunteer leaders, particularly the unit leaders who are promoted from within the unit, or who just kind of happen to be in the right place at the right time, they're the ones who also lack training in leadership and often struggle with that. And they've actually told us that they struggle with not having the right kind of training for this very challenging role. So leadership, unsurprisingly, is often mentioned as a reason for turnover. I've worked with a number of organizations looking at the exit data or exit surveys, and leadership, trust me, is mentioned quite frequently as a reason for why people exited the unit. So with leadership behaviors, what can we do? So we looked at particularly very simple, there's a lot of different models. They're very confusing. They can be very complex. We looked at something super simple, a two behavior model, which has been around in research since 1950s. So it's been around. It has been proven time and again to be very good for thinking about what leadership behaviors constitute. And so there's two behaviors. One of them is person-oriented, and that is leadership that is supportive, that involves recognition, that involves rewarding, that involves active listening, collaboration, and concern for personal well-being. And there's task-oriented leadership, which is more directive, which sets the right sort of expectation, enforces the standard operating procedures in this context, and cares about maintaining high performance. Now, both of these are needed, right? If you imagine, particularly in emergency services, task-oriented leadership is really crucial for, incidents, right? When you are in the middle of an incident, you have to be task-oriented. You have to get everyone on board to do things safely and quickly and efficiently. Person-oriented leadership is also important because it kind of communicates the care that's needed for volunteers. So what we did, we actually tested the effect of these leadership behaviors from the unit leader with SES volunteers here in WEA on two outcomes: thriving, which is the well-being measure, and intent to remain, which is turnover measure. And we collected, importantly, this data 1 year apart. So we can see how leadership behavior affects, over time. So what we find that overall, if you look at the entire sample, only the person-oriented leadership is impacting on well-being. The task-oriented one does not have an impact on either of those two outcomes. However, then we looked at the age differences. So what happens if you look at the younger versus older volunteers? And so the findings were really interesting here. For younger volunteers, we find that they really care about this person-oriented leadership, and that has a strong impact on both thriving or well-being and retention for them. For older volunteers, the task-oriented leadership was more effective in terms of driving their turnover or intention to remain, and marginally driving their well-being as well. So what it tells us is that there's a need for more adaptive leadership, for the unit leaders to actually think and engage in leader behaviors based on the situation and based on who they're dealing with. And this is the key area for leadership training with volunteers and volunteer managers who also work with volunteers in your organizations. So in summary, key points, if you remember anything from this presentation today, is that volunteer expectations need to be managed early, that you can use recruitment messages for successfully managing those expectations early on, and training volunteers in adaptive leadership, or at the very least, the person-oriented leadership that had the biggest impact overall, is really important. And that is me for today. Thank you very much for your time.